Hello, I'm Danna Aduna from Women Doing Philosophy and the University of the Philippines, Baguio. And this is a lecture on feminist logic, particularly the question, is there such a thing as feminist logic? This is a question that Professor Gillian Russell explores in a chapter of Philosophy for Girls, a collection edited by Melissa Shu and Kimberly Garcher. But before we discuss further Gillian Russell's question and the four views that she considers as possible responses, let's have a refresher on some basic definitions in logic. So according to Gillian Russell, the subject matter of logic is good and bad arguments, or their distinction. But what is an argument in logic? An argument, simply speaking, is a reason for thinking that a claim is true. In other words, to give an argument for a claim is to provide reasons for thinking that such claim is true. But we can also give a more technical definition for an argument by first defining some terminology. First, a statement, or also called a proposition, is a sentence that is either true or false. So the equivalent of this in grammar would be the declarative sentence. Next, a premise is a statement that supports the truth of another statement. And finally, a conclusion is a statement that other statements support to be true. Now, given these terms, an argument can now be defined as a set of statements, some of which the premises attempt to provide a reason for thinking that some other statement, the conclusion, is true. Or more concisely, an argument is composed of premises supporting a conclusion. Now, one of the main ways by which arguments are evaluated is by virtue of their validity. A valid argument is an argument in which, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. In other words, validity describes a relationship between the premises and conclusion, particularly the relationship wherein the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. Now, soundness is defined in terms of validity. A sound argument is a valid argument that has all true premises. And given the relationship between premises and conclusion in a valid argument, the conclusion of a sound argument is guaranteed to be true. Now that we've gone over a very brief refresher on some terms in logic, let's revisit the question, is there such a thing as feminist logic? And Russell discusses four possible answers to this question. The first two are versions of the view, no, there's no such thing as feminist logic. And the first reason given, or that might be given, is that feminism and logic simply do not overlap. Meaning, logic is about arguments and their validity, and feminism is about gender justice and gender equality, and these things simply do not have any relation to each other. But Gillian Russell doesn't pay more attention to this view because, according to her, even if they were about two entirely different things, that doesn't discount the possibility that there's something to be gained from their interaction or mutual influence on each other. Now, the second version of that view, there's no such thing as feminist logic, gives an entirely different reason. That reason being that logic is anti-feminist. And Professor Andrea Nye is one of the most well-known thinkers to make such a claim, particularly in her work, Words of Power, a feminist reading of the history of logic. And at the beginning of her work, she recounts her experiences as a student in her first logic class and struggling to get past the ridiculous examples or the incomplete or confusing examples that the logicians gives and just go straight to thinking of them in terms of P's and Q's. And she said, I understood, but struggled to really understand that the content in the examples logicians give are of no importance. What matters is the logic, or in other words, the form. But for her, there is something suspicious about this because she thinks there is something that is silencing in insisting that content doesn't matter and only form does. And she draws the parallel between this kind of silencing and the silencing that institutions in society might perform in order to evade any criticism for ideas that they need to promote in order to perpetuate themselves. So she says the pretense that logic does not speak and cannot be read is only one such institution, an institution whose pretension to absolute truth reduces the respondent, reader, listener to assent or even better, to silence. Why should such a silencing have been necessary or desirable? What are the terms in which, the circumstances in which it could be carried out? Now, Julian Russell, as a professor of logic, of course, finds this particular view quite worrisome because of the implications it will have on her own teaching of logic. But the way she tries to make sense of Andrea Nye's claim is by drawing a connection between the idea that logic is exclusionary and therefore must be rejected with the practice of gender symbolism. Right? And gender symbolism is the coding of certain disciplines, certain objects, certain entities as either masculine or feminine. Meaning, if I gave you a list of fields, philosophy, mathematics, engineering, literature, sociology, psychology, and I asked you which of these fields would tend to be coded in society as masculine and which would be coded as feminine, even if you disagreed with the coding or the classification, I think you would know the answer as to which are more typically viewed as masculine and feminine. And according to Julian Russell, the fact that logic is coded masculine, a fact that she concedes to, doesn't mean that we should reject logic as a whole or as an enterprise. For Julian Russell, logic is simply too powerful and useful to do so. But what we should reject instead, according to her, is that logic is inevitably masculine and should be accessible only to males or cis males. Right? And so let's go to the views that consider a yes answer, that there should be or that is feminist logic. So the first yes answer goes by this form. Feminism should reform logic, and that's why there should be feminist logic. And this is particularly because, according to thinkers like Val Plumwood, classical logic is the logic of domination. Right? And Gillian Russell considers how Plumwood argues that society, particularly powers that be in society, have taken to classical logic, particularly because it's very useful for promoting dualisms. Now, a dualism is a dichotomy or a distinction between two things that privileges one side over the other. So we can think of the dualism between master and slave, reason and emotion, and closer to the matter at hand, masculine and feminine. Right? And for Plumwood, we should be particularly suspicious of classical negation in logic, which is the operation that takes a statement and negates it in order to get the opposing statement. So for instance, if you negate P, you would get not P. For example, it rained today will become it did not rain today, right? And for Plumwood, very similar to Nye's own views earlier, the fact that we are supposed to take negation as a completely objective matter is also suspicious because the taking for granted of negations is precisely the weapon that society or powers that be in society use in order to perpetuate dualisms, for instance, between masculine and feminine, privileging between the two, of course, the masculine, right? But while Gillian Russell finds it interesting and compelling, she says we can think of all sorts of distinctions, which are in fact just distinctions or just propositions that have uh, a relationship of negation to each other, or in the case of predicate logic, predicates that have a relationship of opposition to each other. But there would be no point to holding one above the other. For instance, the distinction between odd numbers and even numbers, positive integers and negative integers, and other things in nature, I suppose, right? So for Gillian Russell, we don't have reason to believe that classical logic and classical negation in themselves embed dualism. Right? So she says this is quite an interesting view that supports the need for a feminist logic, but she doesn't really agree with the reasons that Val Plumwood provides. And so she considers this fourth view, which is also a yes answer. Yes, there should be feminist logic, and feminist logic is simply logic for feminist ends. And the example she gives for this is the ideas of Susan Stebbing, who used logic particularly to rebuke, in Gillian Russell's words, two men, right? Or two male-centric views. So first is a quote from Bertrand Russell, who says, if you're sitting in the underground and a well-dressed woman happens to walk along the car, watch the eyes of the other women. You will see that every one of them, with the possible exception of those who are even better dressed, will watch the woman with malevolent glances and will be struggling to draw inferences derogatory to her. And she criticizes this view of Russell to be an overly general inferential move. Even if Bertrand Russell saw one woman do this, or five women do this, or 10 women do this, there is no reason for him to make that overly general inference that all women, except those who are better dressed, will look harshly upon a woman who was well dressed. Right? Then the second example from Susan Stebbing's work, entitled "Thinking to Some Purpose," that is used by Russell, is the part where Stebbing constructs a speech against women's suffrage, which she says is inspired by actual arguments that men give in order to refute or challenge the women's suffrage movement, right? And she creates this fictional speech. So Gillian Russell talks about how Stebbing also uses logic in order to show the flaws of this particular line of reasoning. So for the second sentence, for instance, women are women and men are men, whatever be their class or rank or country. It is a tautological statement that seems to make some claim or make a strong case for something, presumably anti-women's suffrage, but it's not really clear how it makes that position, right? And then if we look at the first sentence, women have not the capacity of men, and the last sentence, let them content themselves with the noble work some of them are performing so well of influencing their men to judge concerning the gravest political questions of the day. We can actually see that these two statements contradict each other, because if women did not have the capacity of men, we can then ask, why are they capable of influencing their men in judgments concerning political questions. So isn't that kind of a self-revealing argument showing that it's not actually capacity that hinders women from entering the political arena, but quite frankly, just because they are excluded by men from this sphere. So for Julian Russell, this is the most compelling possible answer to the question, is there such a thing as feminist logic? Feminist logic is logic for feminist ends. But what she notes from that final example with Susan Stebbing is that while it's particularly compelling and successful in refuting, for instance, Bertrand Russell's misogynistic statement, or um, this fictional speech by a man who is against women's suffrage, it's not just logic that is problematic in this kind of speech or this kind of thinking. Um, Apart from the logical fallacies that might be embedded in these speeches, they are particularly compelling because they perpetuate social hierarchies that have been there for the longest time. And so Russell proposes that perhaps there is a way to even deepen or broaden the possibility that feminist logic could have if we tried to examine and criticize social structures using logic. And she gives a concrete and very technical example of using David Lewis's work on contract factuals because it has a way of considering different possible worlds and putting them in a hierarchy. And she wonders if there's a way to use Lewis's work in order to examine and later criticize and refute certain social hierarchies, particularly the social hierarchy of the patriarchy. Now, having discussed the four possible views that are considered by Julian Russell, I'd also like to give my own take about what feminist logic as logic for feminist ends. So the fourth view, what form that could take. Right? And I'd like to consider as my first example the instances where thinkers talk about the logic of blank, the logic of some unjust structure. In particular, the logic of capitalism, or closer to the matter at hand, the logic of patriarchy. And a very good and recent example of the latter is Kate Mann's Down Girl, subtitled The Logic of Misogyny, because she specifically studies what she calls the logic of patriarchy in her work. Right? And she says, drawing from other thinkers, that the logic of patriarchy is based on commitments to the following: gender binarism, an anti-trans metaphysics of gender, a heteronormative view of human sexuality, and compulsory monogamy. She also talks about the logic of misogyny, right, which is closely tied to the logic of patriarchy. And for her, what she means by the logic of misogyny is simply the constellation of ideas or beliefs about men and women and gender, practices that the patriarchy has, and norms that the patriarchy promotes, and how all of these taken together make misogyny make sense. Right? So to give a very brief overview, for Kate Mann, misogyny is the enforcing and policing function of the patriarchy, and sexism is the justificatory function or branch of the patriarchy. So the way that misogyny is made to make sense is by sexism operating on an ideological level, promoting ideas about what men's entitlements in a patriarchy are, and what women's roles are in terms of giving those entitlements. And so any instance where women defect from this role as givers or men feel deprived of these entitlements would justify a misogynistic act or misogynistic backlash against women. And according to Kate Mann, the value of understanding or mapping the logic of something like the patriarchy or misogyny is that it puts us in a good position or in a better position to combat it. Okay? So let's now turn to one specific self-perpetuating practice of the patriarchy, and that's gaslighting. Right? I believe that this is another area where feminist logic for feminist ends can also be of help. Right? So Kate Mann in a recent lecture defines gaslighting as a systematic process which functions to make the target illicitly feel defective, either morally or rationally, for epistemic deviance. For example, if one departs from a prescribed narrative or one adheres to a prescribed narrative. Right? And philosopher Julie, in her YouTube channel, makes a very interesting and quite excellent analysis of the relationship between gaslighting and strawman fallacy. So to be concise in explaining the connection, gaslighting would be the purposeful distinction of purposeful distortion of reality to gain control, with the effect of undermining another person's sense of reality, while the strawman fallacy is the purposeful distortion of an argument to gain control, with the result, of course, of undermining another person's argument. And both practices, gaslighting on the one hand and performing the strawman fallacy on the other, involves misrepresentation of some sort. So of the other's views, of the other's intentions, etc. And according to to philosopher Julie, there are some ineffective strategies and some effective strategies of responding to gaslighting as it manifests in the use of strawman fallacy. She says what's ineffective might be adopting the strawman version of your argument and arguing for that argument instead of your original argument, right? And what would be more effective is simply saying, I didn't say that, and this is what I did. And what we see in the work of philosopher Julie is kind of like a smaller scale version of what Kate Mann does in laying out the logic of misogyny and putting us in a good position to combat it. Philosopher Julie draws the connection between gaslighting, which is a manipulative practice, and how it might manifest, particularly in terms of a logical fallacy called the strawman fallacy. And if we are able to see gaslighting in terms of its schema, when it manifests on the level of logical arguments, then we are also better able to combat gaslighting in this particular manifestation. And these are possible examples of what Dr. Leona Smith might call epistemic self-defense. So to summarize, according to Julian Russell, which we are adopting as our own response to the question, is there such a is there such a thing as feminist logic? There is such a thing as feminist logic. It is logic used for feminist ends. Examples have been given by Julian Russell, but for our own examples, we've taken Kate Mann's Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny, where she puts the logic of misogyny or the constellation of ideas and practices and norms of misogyny that make it make sense into a schema that we can now combat and strategize against. And we also looked at the example of philosopher Julie, who draws the connection between the practice of gaslighting and the intentional use of straw man fallacy, and thinks about strategies on how to combat it and how to not be so vulnerable to the intentions of someone who might use a straw man fallacy.